"You're not invited," my son said, blocking the entrance like I was a stranger. And for a moment, every conversation in the room stopped, as if the air itself had been cut in half. I stood there holding a small box in my hands, dressed simply but carefully, looking past him into the ballroom I had once helped pay for. The same place now filled with people pretending not to stare. His wife stood just behind him, her smile polite but distant, the kind that never reaches the eyes, the kind that says more than words ever could. I did not ask why, I did not argue, I did not remind him of anything, because something about the way he said it told me this was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision, one that had been made long before I arrived. I could feel the weight of every glance from the guests inside, the quiet judgment, the curiosity, the subtle discomfort of people witnessing something they knew they should not be seeing. In public events like this are supposed to be warm, full of laughter and celebration, but that night it felt like a stage, and I had just been pushed into the wrong role. I adjusted my grip on the box slightly and took a step forward, not forcefully, not defiantly, just enough to make it clear I was not leaving, not because I needed to stay, but because I chose to. Richard's expression tightened, his jaw setting in a way I recognized from years ago when he thought he was in control of something that was already slipping. "Eleanor, you should not be here," he said again, quieter this time but sharper, and I simply looked at him, not with anger, not with disappointment, just with a calm that made him pause for a fraction of a second. Behind him, I could see guests shifting in their seats, pretending to focus on their drinks, their conversations, anything. But this moment his wife crossed her arms, slightly, her posture straightening, as if preparing for a scene that never came, because I did not give them. When I walked past him slowly, my steps measured my expression, unchanged, and placed the box on the nearest table, near the center of the room. The sound of it touching the surface was soft, but in the silence it carried further than expected. I turned back toward him, then my voice even controlled. "You should open it." I said nothing more, just that simple sentence, but something in the way I said it changed the atmosphere around us. Not louder, not dramatic, just different, like the moment before something shifts and cannot be undone. I could see it in his face, the hesitation, the brief flicker of uncertainty, as if for the first time that night he realized this was not going the way he had planned. And I stood there waiting, not for permission, not for acceptance, but for the moment everything they believed about me would finally start to fall apart. For a moment no one moved, not Richard, not his wife, not even the guests who had been pretending not to watch. The room held its breath in a way that felt almost unnatural, like everyone was waiting for something to break, but nothing did. Not yet. Richard let out a short laugh, the kind meant to dismiss what he did not understand. "This is not necessary," he said, glancing around, as if looking for someone to support him, but no one stepped in, no one spoke. His wife leaned slightly toward him, her voice low but sharp. "Just open it and get it over with," the irritation in her tone barely hidden beneath her controlled expression. I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my posture unchanged. I was not watching the crowd, I was watching him, because this moment was not about them, it was about the shift that was already happening. Whether he realized it or not, he stepped closer to the table, his movements slower, now less certain than before, the confidence he had shown at the entrance beginning to thin in small, almost invisible ways. He reached for the box, his fingers hesitating just for a fraction of a second before lifting the lid. The sound of it sliding open was soft, but in the silence it felt louder than it should have been. Inside, neatly arranged, were documents. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately reveal their weight unless you understood what you were looking at. Richard frowned slightly, pulling one sheet out, his eyes scanning the first few lines, and then stopping, his expression changing, not suddenly, but unmistakably. The room shifted again, the quiet turning heavier as people leaned in just enough to sense that something had changed. His wife stepped closer, now her composure tightening as she tried to read over his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked quietly, but there was an edge in her voice now, something closer to concern than curiosity. Richard did not answer right away, his grip on the paper tightening just enough to crease the corner. He looked up at me then for the first time that night, not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something else, something uncertain. "You should keep reading," I said calmly, my voice steady, not raised, not forced, just present. He looked back down, his eyes moving faster this time, each line taking something from him that he could not immediately replace. I could see it in the way his posture shifted, in the way his shoulders no longer held the same certainty as before. His wife reached for another document, her hands quicker, now her movements less controlled, as she scanned the page, her face tightening as the meaning settled in around This is not possible, she said under her breath, but the words lacked conviction because even as she said them, she knew they were the kind of denial that comes too late. I did not move, I did not step closer, I did not explain because I did not need to. Everything they needed to understand was already in their hands. The room remained silent, not out of politeness, but because no one knew how to respond to what they were witnessing. A moment that had started as quiet humiliation, now shifting into something else, something far more difficult to ignore, and I stood there waiting, not for their reaction, not for their apology, but for the moment they fully understood that nothing about this night belonged to them anymore. The silence did not break all at once, it deepened, the kind of quiet that makes every small movement feel louder than it should. Richard lowered the paper slightly, as if the words on it had become too heavy to hold in front of him. His eyes still fixed on the page, but no longer reading, just staring, as if trying to reshape what he had already understood. His wife took a step back, the document still in her hand, her composure no longer as precise as before, her fingers tightening around the edges. This does not make sense, she said again, but softer, now almost to herself. I tilted my head slightly, not in challenge, not in triumph, just acknowledgement. It makes perfect sense, I said calmly, the words settling into the room without force, without urgency. Richard looked up at me again, this time searching not for an answer, but for a way out of what he was beginning to realize. This is your name, he said quietly, his voice stripped of the confidence it had carried earlier. I held his gaze for a moment before nodding. Yes, it always has been, I replied, the simplicity of the answer, leaving no space for argument. Around us the guests had stopped pretending not to listen, their attention fully drawn now not by spectacle, but by the quiet certainty of what was unfolding. A few exchanged glances, others remained still, as if unsure whether they were witnessing something private or something that had just become public without permission. His wife shook her head slightly, stepping closer again, as if proximity might change the meaning of what she was seeing. You transferred this, she said quickly, her voice sharper, now trying to rebuild control. You must have done this recently. I did not move, I did not react immediately. I let the moment stretch, just enough for her words to lose their structure before answering. Nothing was transferred, I said. It was never yours to begin with. Richard's grip on the paper loosened, then tightened again, his eyes moving across the lines, one more time, slower, now more deliberate, as if hoping to find something he had missed, but there was nothing left to reinterpret. The document said exactly what it was meant to say: ownership, authority, final decisions, all clearly defined long before this night ever existed. I took a small step forward, not to close the distance, but to bring the moment into focus. You organized this entire evening, I said quietly. The venue, the guest list, the presentation, everything planned so carefully as if it belonged to you. I paused just long enough for the words to settle before continuing. But you never asked the one question that mattered. His wife's expression shifted again, the control she had been holding onto slipping just enough to reveal what had been underneath. What question? She asked, her voice no longer steady. I looked at both of them, then my expression unchanged. Who actually owns it, I said, and the answer no longer needed to be spoken because it was already in their hands. The room remained still, but the meaning of that stillness had changed. It was no longer anticipation, it was realization, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles piece by piece until there is nothing left to deny. And I stood there watching, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was the moment. Everything they had built on assumption finally met the truth they had chosen to ignore. No one spoke for several seconds, and that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. Richard slowly lowered the document onto the table, but his hand did not fully let go of it, as if releasing it would make everything more real. His wife remained beside him, but her posture had changed. The confidence that once held her upright now replaced with something tighter, more uncertain. You should have told us, she said finally, her voice controlled but strained, as if she was trying to rebuild something that had already collapsed. I looked at her briefly before answering. Told you what, I said calmly, that you built your lives on something you never owned. The words were not sharp, but they did not need to be. Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before returning to me. Why would you do this here, he asked, and there it was, not an apology, not confusion, but a shift toward blame, as if the problem was not what had been done but where it had been revealed. I held his gaze steady. Because this is where you chose to make it public, I said. You decided who belonged here, you decided who did not, and you made that decision in front of everyone. I let the words settle before continuing, so it felt appropriate that the truth would do the same. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to confirm that the moment had fully shifted from private tension to public understanding. His wife stepped forward slightly, her tone softening, now trying a different approach. "We can talk about this later," she said quietly. "This is not the place." I shook my head once, just enough to be clear. "You already decided this was the place," I replied. "The difference is that now it is no longer on your terms." Richard looked down again at the documents, then back at me, his expression no longer defensive, but unsettled, as if he was trying to calculate something that no longer followed the rules he had relied on for so long. "You are going to embarrass us," he said under his breath. I paused for a moment, not because I needed time, but because the answer deserved to be given without emotion. "Embarrassment comes from being seen clearly," I said, "and tonight that is exactly what is happening." I stepped closer to the table, then not to confront but to close the distance between assumption and reality. "Everything in that box," I continued, "was signed years ago, before any of this, before the house, before the business, before any of the things you have been presenting as your own." I looked at both of them, then not searching, not questioning, just stating what had always been true. "You did not lose anything tonight," I said. "You were never given what you thought you had." The room remained still, but the meaning had shifted again. Not tension, not anticipation, but recognition, the kind that settles quietly and does not leave. And I stood there knowing that whatever came next would not change what had already been made clear in front of everyone. Richard did not respond right away, his silence no longer controlled, but heavy, as if every second gave the truth more time to settle in. Around him, his wife looked between us, then back at the documents, her fingers tightening around the edges, as if holding onto them could somehow change what they meant. "This is not finished," she said quietly, her voice lower, now more careful, as if choosing a different path forward. "We can fix this." I watched her for a moment, not dismissing her words, but not accepting them either. There was nothing to fix, because nothing had been broken tonight, only revealed. "You have been living in something that was never yours," I said calmly, "and the difference matters." Richard finally spoke, then his voice slower, less certain than before. "You let us believe it was ours," he said. And there it was, the shift again, not toward understanding, but toward justification. I nodded slightly. "I let you build your lives," I said. "I did not interfere. I did not take anything away from you. But belief does not create ownership, and assumption does not change reality." The room felt smaller, now not physically, but in the way truth removes everything unnecessary, leaving only what cannot be avoided. A guest near the back shifted slightly, the sound subtle but enough to remind everyone that this was no longer just a private exchange. This had become something witnessed, something understood beyond the three of us. His wife stepped closer to him, her voice softer, now almost persuasive. "We should not do this here," she said again, as if repeating it might restore control. "We can talk about this later, in private." Richard glanced at her, then back at me, his expression caught between frustration and something he could not fully name. I held his gaze steady. "There is nothing left to discuss privately," I said. "You made your decision in public, and now you are hearing the truth in the same way." I paused briefly, not to create tension, but because the moment required clarity. "The documents in that box are not new, they are not temporary, they are not something that can be changed because of this conversation. Everything was decided long before tonight, before the house, before this event, before the life you have been presenting as your own." His wife exhaled slowly, her composure shifting again, not breaking but adjusting, as if she was recalculating what could still be controlled and what had already slipped beyond reach. "Then what are you saying?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but direct. I took a step back, not retreating, but giving the moment space to settle. "I am saying that nothing changes tonight," I replied. "You will continue exactly as you have been for now." The words seemed to surprise them both, not because they expected kindness, but because they expected immediate consequence. Richard frowned, slightly confusion replacing tension. "What does that mean?" he asked. I met his gaze calmly. "It means you will have time," I said, "time to understand exactly what you have been standing on, and what happens when that foundation is no longer yours to rely on." The room remained silent again, but this time the silence carried something different, not shock, not tension, but anticipation, the kind that follows when the outcome has been set but not yet fully realized. And I stood there knowing that what I had given them was not relief, but something far more difficult: to face the space between what they believed and what was about to change. No one moved immediately after I finished speaking, the kind of stillness that does not come from calm, but from realization. Slowly settling into place, Richard looked down at the documents again, as if hoping something had changed in the few seconds since he last read them, but nothing had. and it never would. His wife stepped back this time not to regain control, but because she no longer had it, her posture shifting from composed to cautious, as if she was beginning to understand that whatever she said next would not return things to how they were. "You are not going to do anything tonight," Richard said finally, his voice quieter, now almost searching for reassurance. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, "not tonight." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than comfort. They carried inevitability. His shoulders lowered just a fraction, the tension in his stance loosening, but not disappearing, because even he understood this was not resolution, this was delay. His wife crossed her arms again, but this time it was not defensive, it was protective, as if she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. Then when she asked, her voice steady, but thinner. Then before I looked at her for a moment before answering soon enough, I said, "But not in a way you can prepare for." That was the truth, not because I intended anything dramatic, but because real consequences do not arrive with warnings. They arrive when everything else has already been decided around you. A guest near the front shifted again, the quiet sound of a chair moving against the floor, reminding everyone that this moment was still being watched, still unfolding in a room that had started the evening with celebration and now held something entirely different. I turned slightly, glancing around not to address the crowd, but to acknowledge the space itself, the carefully arranged tables, the decorations, the effort that had gone into presenting a life that was now being seen from a different angle. "You planned this evening very carefully," I said calmly, bringing my attention back to them. "Every detail, every guest, every impression you wanted to make." Richard did not respond, but his expression tightened slightly, as if he could feel where the words were leading. "But you built it on something you never verified," I continued, "and that is where everything changed." His wife inhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for just a moment before lifting again, as if she was trying to rebuild her composure piece by "Piece, you should have told us," she said again, but this time the words lacked direction. I held her gaze without reaction. "You should have asked," I replied quietly, and that was the difference. Not secrecy, not deception, but assumption, something they had relied on until it no longer held. I stepped back then, not retreating, but creating distance between what had been revealed and what would come next. "I am not here to take anything from you tonight," I said. "I am here to make sure you understand what has always been mine." The room remained silent once more, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was settled, like something that had found its place, whether anyone was ready for it or not. And I stood there knowing that the evening they had planned would be remembered not for what it was meant to celebrate, but for what it had finally exposed. Richard did not speak immediately, and this time his silence felt different. Not uncertain, not defensive, but measured, as if he was trying to understand what was still within his control and what had already slipped beyond it. His wife stood beside him, her posture no longer rigid, but recalibrated, her expression carefully neutral, as if she had already begun adjusting to a new version of reality that she had not prepared for. The room around us remained still, but no longer tense. The initial shock had passed, and what remained was something quieter, something more observant, the kind of attention people give when they realize they are witnessing the moment. Everything changes without needing to be told. I reached for the box, then closing it slowly, not out of finality, but out of completion. The purpose it had served was already fulfilled. Richard watched the movement closely, his eyes following every detail as if trying to extract meaning from something that no longer held any hidden layers. "So that is it," he said finally, his voice low, not challenging, not questioning, just acknowledging. I met his gaze briefly. "That is enough," I replied calmly, because it was nothing more needed to be added, nothing needed to be proven further. The truth had already done its work. His wife shifted slightly, then stepping forward, just enough to enter the space between us. "Without fully closing it, what happens now?" she asked, her tone controlled, but different now, no longer leading, no longer shaping the direction, only seeking it. I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because the answer did not require urgency. "Now you continue exactly as you have been," I said, "your routines, your plans, your responsibilities. None of that changes." Immediately Richard frowned, slightly, confusion returning, but softer than before. "That does not make sense," he said. I nodded. "It does," I replied, "because what matters is not what you do next, it is what you understand before you do it." I let the words settle without elaborating, allowing them to sit in the space where assumption had once filled every gap. His wife looked down briefly, then back up, her composure returning in a different form, not control, not confidence, but awareness. And for the first time, she did not try to redirect the moment. She simply stood there, absorbing it. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if the weight of resistance had finally given way to something more grounded. I stepped back then, creating a clear distance between us, not as separation, but as definition. This evening was yours, I said. Quietly, you planned it, you invited everyone, you decided who belonged here. I paused briefly before continuing, but now everyone here understands what that actually means. I glanced around the room, then not addressing anyone directly, but acknowledging the presence of those who had seen everything unfold, not through spectacle, but through clarity. When I looked back at them, neither Richard nor his wife spoke, and they did not need to. The shift had already happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and in that quiet recognition, I knew that whatever came next would not require explanation, only time for it to fully take its place. No one tried to stop me as I reached for the box again and held it briefly in my hands before setting it aside completely, the gesture simple but final, as if closing a chapter that had already written itself. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that waited for something to happen. It was the kind that follows when everything that needed to happen already. As Richard stood where he was, his posture no longer rigid but unsettled, his eyes shifting between me and the space around us, as if trying to understand how quickly everything had changed without anything actually moving. His wife remained beside him, but her presence felt different now, less commanding, more observant, as if she had stepped out of the role she had been playing and was now trying to see the situation without it. What are you going to do? She asked finally, her voice steady, but no longer leading. I looked at her, not unkindly, but without hesitation. Nothing. Tonight, I said calmly, and that was the truth, because what mattered had already been done. This was never about taking something in the moment. It was about removing the illusion that had allowed everything else to exist. Richard let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering further, as if something he had been holding onto had finally given way. You could have told me, he said again, but this time the words sounded different, not defensive, not blaming, just quieter. I met his gaze briefly. I could have, I replied, but you never asked, and the distinction remained clear, not hidden, not complicated, just overlooked. His wife glanced at him, then back at me, her expression thoughtful, now not calculating, as if she was beginning to see the shape of something she had not considered before. Then what changes? She asked. I paused for a moment, not because I needed to think, but because the answer was not immediate in the way they expected. What changes is what you understand, I said quietly. Everything else will follow in its own time. The words settled into the room without force but with weight, because they carried something that could not be rushed or avoided. A few guests began to shift slightly, their attention no longer fixed, but still present, as if they understood the moment had passed, but its meaning would remain long after the evening ended. I stepped back then, not retreating, but creating space between us and the version of this situation that had existed only minutes before. This was your evening, I said softly, and it can continue however you choose, but it will not continue the way you believed it would. Richard did not respond. He simply nodded once, slowly, the movement small but significant, as if acknowledging something he could not yet fully express. His wife remained still, her composure returning, but not as control, rather as awareness. And in that quiet shift I knew that the balance had already changed, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And once clarity is seen, it cannot be unseen. And I turned slightly, then not to leave immediately, but to signal that what needed to be said had already been completed. I did not say anything else because there was nothing left that needed to be said. The room had already shifted, the moment had already passed, and what remained was not confrontation, but understanding, the kind that settles quietly and changes everything without asking for permission. I picked up my bag from the chair beside me, my movements steady, unhurried, not as someone leaving in defeat, but as someone who had already completed what they came to do. Richard watched me closely, his expression no longer guarded or defensive, but something more uncertain, as if he was seeing me for the first time without the assumptions he had relied on for so long. His wife stood beside him, still composed, but no longer in control of the space around her. She did not speak again, neither of them did, and that silence said more than anything they could have added. I turned slightly toward the exit, the soft sound of my steps carrying across the room in a way that felt almost intentional, not loud, not dramatic, just present. The guests parted subtly, not making a scene, but creating space the way people do when they recognize something significant has already happened. And they're simply witnessing the end of it. I reached the doorway and paused for just a moment, my hand resting lightly against the frame, not to reconsider, not to look back, but to acknowledge what this had been. Not the evening they planned, not the story they wanted told, but The moment everything had been seen clearly for what it was, I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the noise from inside fading behind me as the door closed, the lights still glowing through the glass, but no longer part of my world. I walked toward my car without hesitation, the quiet around me no longer heavy, but settled like something that had finally found its place. I set my bag inside and took one last breath before starting the engine, not out of relief, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity, because that was what remained when everything unnecessary had been stripped away. They believed they could decide where I belonged. They believed they could define what was mine and what was not, but they never understood that ownership is not something you claim. It is something that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. And as I drove away, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding what was behind me, but because there was nothing left there that required my attention. The truth had already been spoken, and once spoken, it does not need to be repeated. It simply remains.